So last we met, we were looking at the introduction to obedience and disobedience, and looked at Milgram's obedience to authority, and then various other points of obedience. Now our first reading in obedience and disobedience is on the side of obeying, from our good dead friend Socrates. Now, Socrates, in the dialogue we'll look at, the Crito, gave a little setup. In the previous dialogue, the Apology, Socrates has been put on trial. He's been accused of various and sundry crimes, such as corrupting the youth, believing in foreign gods, being an atheist, and various other sort of odd charges. And in the course of the trial, he's found guilty and then sentenced to death. Now, what happens is while Socrates is waiting to die, they can't execute him because there's a ship that's supposed to return to Athens as part of a celebration of the defeat of the Minotaur by the great hero Theseus. And while the ship is out at sea, there can be no executions in Athens, and a storm delays the ship. And so Socrates is in prison waiting for his execution, and his friends, led by his friend Crito, come to him and say, Socrates, we're going to bust you out. And so that's the setup for it. So he's in prison after his trial, waiting for his death. Now, one of the reasons why Socrates was probably in trouble was for his distrust in democracy. Now, the time period when Socrates is in jail and about to be put to death, Athens was a democracy, at least in the sense that male property owners could vote, which by our modern standards would seem to be pretty limited, but compared to having like a despotic, warlord or ruler, I guess at least you have some democracy, because at least some people are voting. Now, the reason why Socrates had a distrust of democracy was because of the following argument he gave. Suppose you felt a sharp pain in your left side, and you are like, pain. Would you say to the people around you, good citizens, I'm feeling a terrible pain. We must vote to decide what I'm suffering from, and then we'll vote to see who gets to, cut me open. Would medicine by democracy be effective? With people just voting?
No.
No, because people, that would go badly. Or similarly, if you were, take another case, if you're trying to design like a bridge, would that be done by like having everybody get together and say, okay, let's vote on how we're going to build this, and we'll all just vote. Everyone votes. Everyone gets one vote on how we're going to build it, how it's going to be set up, what materials we're going to use. Would that go well?
No.
Now, in the case of medicine, we don't ask the crowd, we ask, and then also, who would you trust to make a judgment about cutting you open?
Nobody.
Well, suppose you have a lot of pain.
The doctor.
Yeah, doctors, hopefully. And if you're designing a bridge, you wouldn't go to like the crowd, you'd go to a
Construct.
yeah, someone like an engineer to design it, people or construction people to build it. And so his argument is that, difficult, complicated things, we don't just like vote on it and have the many who don't know what they're doing, we turn to the person who has knowledge. And so his argument is grounds the distrust for democracy, because if you have just lots of people voting on stuff, then the question is, are you actually getting good results? Now, because Socrates' solution, at least laid on the public, was, this may be considered a disastrous idea, but his view was you had to get people who knew in charge, and he thought the best people to be rulers would be true philosophers. But he claimed the way you could tell someone was suitable for this is you would have to force them to rule, because they wouldn't want to do it. And which leads to the view that seems often sensible, whoever really wants to be in charge, they probably shouldn't be in charge, because they're probably up to something. And someone who doesn't want to be in charge, well, they may be no good at it, but maybe the best person for the job would be someone who's competent, but really doesn't want the job, because they would just get things done and just, move on. Now, are there any reasons to think Socrates would be wrong, that we should have democracy? Because if he's right, then our whole political system is a bad idea. Well, one reason might be, well, suppose, we'll use like another sort of example. Suppose you're the group of friends deciding like what movie to go to. Should you have your movie expert friend decide for you, or should you get to choose?
I guess you say the movie expert in this case, but I would choose.
Yeah, I think you should choose because you may have an expert in movies, but your right to choose seems to be an important thing. So an argument might be, well, we don't want the best solution. We want to have a say in what happens, even if it's not the best solution. So an argument might be that, okay, we may not get the best stuff, but it's important that all of us have a role in the deciding process. And you could argue, like our good dead friend Jacques Rousseau did, that maybe the many would come up with good solutions to things. And there's the notion of like the wisdom of crowds. And they have found that, interestingly, boringly enough, that people working as a group, as long as they're not being sort of like led astray or they don't have like an agenda, an axe to grind, they'll often get right answers about stuff. They're actually pretty good, even with things that seem kind of complicated. I mean, one good illustration is, I mentioned before, was guessing the weight of a cow. And what they did is there's one of the state fairs, they have a contest, like guess how much the cow weighs, kind of like guessing how many jelly beans are in a jar type of deal, except the cow. And they found that when they had people just sort of, putting in all their estimates, they found that when they averaged it all out, it was really close. That people, even though there were some like ones off, way off, it all sort of canceled out, and they kind of get the right answer. So maybe that if you have like a true democracy, which is not being swayed or misled or hijacked, maybe Socrates is wrong. Maybe the wisdom of the crowds does work. Now, given that Socrates distrusted democracy, a good question would be, so why did he agree to go to prison? Well, his view was this. Socrates, as we'll see in a bit, seems to accepted because he's pretty dead now, what's called a social contract theory. We saw this in Locke and Hobbes, and it's the idea that we have an obligation to obey if we agree to do so, that we form a contract. And many thinkers, Locke, Rousseau, Hobbes, and Socrates, hold to that view. We may not have like an explicit contract we sign like with employment, we say like, I'll do the following stuff. But the idea is that either tacitly or maybe actually explicitly, we do agree to a set of rules. Now, in terms of like the implicit one is, the idea is that if you're just kind of born into a society and you remain, the idea is even though you don't actually sign a form saying I agree, you do. Supposedly. Now, there's also, of course, the sort of explicit agreement. When people come to the United States and become naturalized citizens, they actually have to go through a process saying they'll, uphold the Constitution, etc. And so they enter into a pretty clear social contract. But Socrates, as we'll see in a bit, accepted a form of this. Now, in terms of sort of the ethics of this, Socrates seemed to accept a natural law theory. The idea that behind human laws, what sort of justifies them, is an objective moral order. And this is kind of an interesting question about the foundation of laws. We do make a lot of stuff up. People just down in the State House, the Capitol building, they're just making stuff up. They can make up whatever. And if they get enough people to vote for it, it becomes law. But there's the interesting and important question, is there something beyond the law we can use to judge the law? And Socrates falls into the natural law tradition, and then he believes there's something behind the law that he can use to judge the law, objective ethics. And then he died, and he's still dead.
Did he die from after?
Yep. Drinking the poison. Hemlock, he dies. So, important thing to know is don't drink hemlock. So we turn to the Crito, which is a dialogue set after the Apology. And again, the scenario is that he's locked up in this prison, and his friends have basically shown up to bust him out. Kind of a great escape sort of scenario. Now, Socrates being Socrates, of course, doesn't just like take off with them, he's going to argue. And so they come and say, look, we've got some bribes paid off, we've got a way to get you out of the city. There's other cities that has agreed to take you in, and so we can just get out of here, you don't have to die. And so Socrates, of course, being Socrates, says, well, wait a minute, we have to discuss whether or not this would be the right thing to do. And the issue that he raises is whether escaping would be an injustice or not, whether it would be morally acceptable for him to flee at this point, or does he have to remain? And so he considers three arguments as to why he should stay and die. And we know that he stays, because that's how he dies, so spoiler alert. Actually too late for spoiler alert, I've already spoiled it. Now, two of the arguments are ones that can be applied to almost anyone. The second one is particular to Socrates. So what are the arguments? Well, the first argument could be cast as the benefit argument. And here's how it works. Socrates argues that the state benefited him in various ways. So, he was born in the state, and it provided various goods and services to him. Things like, things that we get today. May provide, like, we get a lot of stuff from, the state, which is basically shorthand for, everyone, cooperating together, providing social services. So we have things like hospitals that, a person might be born into, could very likely be a public hospital, supported by, in part by maybe, public dollars. Then the person might have been, the person's mother might have been brought there by an ambulance, perhaps paid for in part by public dollars. And then, of course, people grow up. As they grow up, they often go to a public school, paid for by, public dollars. And then, of course, they benefit from fire protection, police protection, roads, all of the infrastructure of society, legal system, all that stuff. It's all provided, in shorthand by the state, by all of us. And so Socrates argues that he gets all these benefits from the state. That's to say, all the other people of Athens who work together to provide these goods and services. And he notes that he had the freedom, the rather important point is, he had the freedom to leave. The rule in Athens was that when someone became an adult, they could take their stuff and just leave. They were free to go. Which, actually most, we don't explicitly have the rule in countries, but people are free to leave. If a person decides, I'm kind of tired of living in the United States, they can, get their passport, and they can go and live in some other country. France, England, Canada, Mexico.
Wait, when he was in jail, he was free to leave?
Oh, no, it's a good question. Then he was locked up.
Oh.
Yeah, but he was, before, during his lifetime, he could have left any time he wanted to. Once he became an adult, the rule is he could just pack up his stuff and say, see you, Athens. Now, in the United States, of course, we have a similar thing. Assuming someone is not, in jail already, same deal. People are free to leave. And people can even renounce their citizenship. There's a process for doing that. Interestingly, there are people who do this now. Now, one of the main reasons that some people renounce their citizenship is to avoid taxes. Because as long as you're a United States citizen, if you live in France or Germany, etc., technically you still owe taxes. And so one way to avoid that is, perhaps an extreme way, is a person can renounce their citizenship. So they're free to leave and renounce their American citizenship. And occasionally people do this because of the tax. Usually very, very wealthy, and they'd rather not pay the taxes, so they just renounce and become a citizen in a place with better taxes. Corporations also do this too. It's called corporate inversion, where a company gets bought by a foreign company, and then they become that foreign company. For example, a pharmaceutical company recently was based in the United States, and they were purchased by an Irish company, and they kept the same name, same CEO, same stock market ticker, but now, since it's owned by an Irish company, It's an Irish company. It doesn't have to pay US taxes. And so people are in companies and corporations, according to like Mitt Romney, are people too. So they're free to leave. So Socrates lays out, the state benefited us, we were free to leave. So then why do we have to obey? Well, here's the answer. He lays out, the three counts, like it's obeying, disobeying parents, etc., but boil it down to basically one main thing. If we accept the benefits of the state, that's to say the benefits provided by the other citizens, and we're not kept there by force, we're free to leave, this obligates us to obey because we've accepted the benefits. To use a modern example, when I went to school to get a Pell Grant, federal financial aid, I had to provide proof that I was registered with the Selective Service, also known as the draft. And the idea is that they benefited me. I got to get financial aid. And there's only male students that would do this, so I think may still be the case. It's totally sexist. We're being oppressed. And in return for agreeing to Selective Service, I was able to get the federal financial aid and the Pell Grant. And I didn't have to accept it. I could have refused the money. But the idea is that if I accept the money, and I didn't have to accept it, I wasn't forced to accept it, if they said, if they had a draft, say during the first Iraq War, and my number came up, according to Socrates, I'd be obligated to go, because I accepted the benefits. I didn't have to accept them, I agreed to them, so I'm obligated to stick around. So, parents often make this argument, which is the classic, if you're under my roof, you have to obey. Yeah. And if the kids don't like it, once they're adults, they can leave and be on their own. So does that seem like a reasonable thing? If someone accepts the benefits and they're free to not accept them, but part of the deal is, the obligation, are people obligated? Does that obligate people?
Some people get comfortable and don't want to leave them, so.
Yeah, they may get a little comfy.
Yeah. But they're not.
Now, one point worth considering, though, is how free the person might actually be. So, for example, in my case, I could have refused the federal financial aid and not gone to college. So, in a way, I was free to make that choice. It was accept the money or, don't go to school. But you might say that's not like completely free. It's kind of coerced. Similarly, like, if someone's working a job, people are free to quit at any time if perhaps they wish to go without food and shelter and so on. So there's the question about how free is free. That's the first argument. Benefits, when you have the freedom to not accept them, would basically entails obedience. But of course there are important questions about how free is free really, and how much do you actually owe in return for these benefits. So to use a concrete example, if someone grows up in the United States and they decide that they'd rather not remain a citizen because they find the taxes too burdensome, do they have the right to just skedaddle, even though they accepted the benefits? And of course some would argue, yes, they do. Others would say, well, that would be, skedaddling at that point would be wrong, to accept all those benefits and just, take them off. But Socrates does say people have the freedom to leave, so perhaps that would handle that as well. Before going to a second argument, anything about argument one that needs any more Socratic stuff? Second argument is particular to Socrates. So unless someone happens to be in Socrates' circumstances, wouldn't apply to them. But here's how his argument works. During his trial, the way the trial worked was, the first step was deciding guilt or innocence. And so they were deciding whether he was guilty of all the crimes. And the vote was majority yes. The second phase of the trial was deciding on the punishment. So it's different from our system. Like in our system, we have the criminal trial. You have the trial typically by jury for guilt or innocence. And then there's the sentencing phase. The way they were doing in Athens at this point is that the person who is found guilty of the crime would propose a penalty, and the person, the accuser, would propose a penalty as well, and they would vote to decide which penalty was applied. In the case of Socrates, his accuser Miletus chose death as the penalty. And Socrates initially said to be, his punishment was he would be kept at the public expense at the nicest place in town, basically. You know, being put in this great, wonderful place where they kept, where the people who won the Olympics would stay. Which of course was not a punishment at all. And then he offered to pay like a small fine, and he could have chosen exile. So his argument is that if he sneaks away now, you know, sneaking away literally like a criminal in the night, when he could have simply chosen exile, and they probably would have voted for it, and he could have done so with the state's consent. So his argument is that he gave all, you know, this speech about how he'd rather, you know, remain and die, that this would be just absurd and silly. So the gist of the second argument is basically, he could have picked exile during his trial and gone with the state's, you know, agreement, but instead he, you know, put on this bold defense, which resulted in being sentenced to death, and now he would seem quite foolish to go back on that. Now again, this is not a general argument because unless a person has done a similar thing, this would not be a reason to stay and obey the state. The third argument, though, is a general one, and it goes like this. It's the contract argument. It's kind of similar to the benefit argument with a slight variation. The benefit one is basically, well, I accepted all these goodies, so I guess I'm obligated. You know, going back to the parents, I'm living under their roof, eating all their food, watching their TV, using their internet, etc. So I'm obligated to follow the rules as long as I'm there. The contract argument, though, this is a bit of a variant. The idea is not just that he's benefiting and staying, it's that he agreed to remain. Now in this case, he's talking about tacit consent, because he didn't like sign a form saying, I, Socrates, will obey the city of Athens. But the way it worked is that by remaining in the city, when he was free to leave, he created a tacit contract. So the deal, the agreement was, if he stayed, then he agreed to the rules, you know, a tacit agreement. And as long as he says the contract is not created by force, he wasn't compelled to remain, he could have left, you know, well, at least before being put in jail, and he wasn't tricked into it, it wasn't a fraudulent or forced contract, then the idea is that, well, it's a legitimate agreement. He knew the situation, he wasn't tricked into it, he wasn't forced into it, and he remained, you know, for his life, and this obligates him to obey, even though the obedience will lead to his death. Now this became a pretty standard model for social contracts, because, you know, people can raise the obvious point, unless they became nationalized and actually did explicitly swear an oath, they are just born here. They never actually sign a form saying, you know, I agree to obey the rules. But that is that people give tacit consent. By remaining, one agrees. Now it does put on, as I mentioned, two important sort of exceptions. One is if people are forced, or people are kept there by fraud. So if Socrates was asked, well, what about like a dictatorship, where they put, you know, guards around the borders to keep people from escaping, and that, you know, you're prevented from leaving the country. Socrates would say in that case, well, if you're compelled to remain there by force, then you wouldn't owe obedience to that state, because they are forcing you, they're compelling you, you don't have a choice. Or if it was like a trick, you know, kind of like in the, you know, sci-fi movies, you know, where they have like the state tricking people into thinking they're getting benefits or that it's a good system. And if the person finds out, you know, one of the sort of classic things is the heroes find out that the whole system is just a lie, and then they expose it. In that case, of course, the obligation of the state, Socrates would say, would be gone, because it's based on a trick. So Socrates finishes his argument, his friends are very sad, and then at the end of the dialogue, the executioner brings in the cup of hemlock, as the ship has arrived, and he takes the hemlock, he drinks it, and then shortly thereafter, he dies. And of course, he's still dead today.
Before I leave, you probably said it, but he got convicted because he tried to get the crowd to vote. Is that what it was?
Oh, no, there are a variety of charges against Socrates. One was he was accused of corrupting the youth.
Mm-hmm.
Of what that seemed to be was he would go and ask people questions. You know, he'd make inquiries of the politicians, the artists, people who claimed to know stuff, and he'd show that they didn't know what they were talking about. And then the youth started imitating him, and this annoyed the politicians and so forth.
Gotcha.
And so they accused him of corrupting the youth. He was also accused, excuse me, of believing in foreign gods, his own gods, basically. And then he was also charged, weirdly, with being an atheist. And then there were charges like making the worse appear the better cause, and also investigating things in the heavens and the earths, you know, various kind of weird things. But the main big ones were corrupting the youth and the religious charges against him.
Okay.
But the people who, you know, study Socrates for a living think the main reason was because he antagonized the people in power, and so they wanted to get rid of him because he was causing too much trouble. Okay. Thanks. Okay, now we turn to Henry David Thoreau. A little background for him. He was an American guy, and he ended up becoming part of what's called the Transcendental Movement, which involved, you know, a literary movement for the most part. And in terms of putting it in sort of political perspective, he's classified now as an anarchist, someone who believes that there should be no government. Now, his main works, probably his best known work, is the work on Walden Pond, which was sort of rediscovered in the 60s and very popular. And his other, probably his other somewhat known work is his essay on civil disobedience. And that's which laid out the origins of our modern notion of civil disobedience. The idea that if a law is unjust or unfair, people should break that law, get arrested, accept their punishment, and the idea that it would bring about change. Now, his motivation for writing the essay on civil disobedience was two things he considered unjust. The first was the war against Mexico, which he regarded as morally wrong, and basically a war of, you know, conquest and thievery. The second thing he was opposed to was the Fugitive Slave Act and slavery in general. He regarded that as morally wrong. And so he saw as the problem was war and slavery. And what he wanted people to do was to civilly disobey against both and put an end to the war and to put an end to slavery. How'd that work out? Well, this was back in the early 1840s, so the Mexican War went on, which is how we got Texas and New Mexico and California. It's worked out pretty good for us, not so good for Mexico. And of course, it took the Civil War to put an end to slavery. And so his own impact was pretty small. Except, of course, the concept of civil disobedience was later picked up by a fellow named Gandhi, applied in India, and then came back across to the United States, picked up by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and applied in the American Civil Rights Movement. So at his own time, not much impact, but later on, had an effect. Now, his essay, the classic short essay, is on the duty of civil disobedience, which is kind of not really an ironic title, but in some ways actually ironic, because it's a duty to disobey. Now, one of Thoreau's signature quotes is, of course, the best government is a government that governs least, which is still a popular quote today. So the idea is that less government is better. And this is a sentiment still echoed to this day, but typically by conservatives, because interestingly enough, if we look at today's political system, people who are conservatives on the right, they claim to advocate small government, and people who are on the left generally push for larger government. And Thoreau, in this regard, would be saying something that people who are conservatives would tend to agree with. And connecting it to 2015, we see the Republican candidates like Trump and Carson and Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio advocating small government. They're going to reduce the size. And that's very Thoreauian. Now, he even said that the best government is a government that governs not at all. Because Thoreau is as mentioned, an anarchist. He believes that there should ultimately be no government. So, what's the problem with government? Well, these, if you follow modern American politics, these will be things that sound quite familiar. These have been brought up for centuries. As he sees it, one problem is the government, and this is echoed today in arguments from conservatives, the government gets in the way of business. Its regulations, its taxes, etc. They prevent things from getting done. And he thinks that government would best serve society and business by getting out of the way. So it's an argument we see echoed even now, that government regulations are impediment, and the best thing to do is get rid of them. That government interferes with getting things done, and the best thing the government can do is just step out of the way and let people do things. And so it's the classic argument of the government is bad because it interferes, and the solution is to have less, or ideally none at all. Now, Thoreau does waffle a bit about getting rid of it completely. He does say that what we need is less government, but also better government. So he does advocate anarchism, but he does kind of back off against total anarchism. You're getting rid of all government. And it's still an interesting question today, namely, how much government should we have? Is less government, is that better government? Is the government that governs least the best? Or are there some things the government should be doing? And as usual, our upcoming election involves looking at people who make proposals like that. Again, Republicans traditionally say smaller government or no government, if they want to go full anarchist. And then people who are Democrats usually talk about expanding. So we have Donald Trump claiming, among other things, to reduce the federal government, lower regulations, etc. And we have Bernie Sanders proposing to expand the government. And so we have that classic debate going on. And Thoreau would, well, actually, he'd probably like Bernie, but he would be for less and better government. And I think Trump would horrify. Probably. Well, given what as we'll see what Thoreau says later on.
Do you think Thoreau advocated better government instead of total anarchism because he felt that maybe total anarchism would cause chaos in our country or where he was?
Yeah, he probably had some concerns about that because he does, what he says later on, he talks about, well, we need things like roads and schools and so on. So, yeah, I think even though there are still anarchists today, when you really ask the anarchists, well, how would things work? How would we have roads and so on? And they start thinking about the practicality of it, they tend to think, well, I guess we need people running things like roads and schools. But then we end up, then that's just government.
Exactly.
We just call it something different. And so, yeah, I think Thoreau kind of, because he does sort of say, government that governs best is government governed not at all. But then he kind of backs that back to less government. And that is a classic problem with anarchism. How do you organize stuff and make things work on a large scale? Where they might say, well, we'll have committees or people doing this, but then you'd say, well, that's still government. And usually the reply back, well, government involves coercion. People are being oppressed and forced to do stuff. And if someone says, well, we want government without oppression and coercion, you could say, well, that's probably good. Now, what also pushes his dislike of government? Well, in the US, in most democracies, well, kind of by definition, there's a notion of majority rule, which is that things are supposed to be decided by the majority. Now, he thinks that's a problem, which may seem kind of odd because are we normally told that majority rule is a good thing? Yeah, typically, we were kind of brought up saying, sort of democracy, voting is good, majority rule is good, and we should go along with the majority. And often we make decisions like in formal everyday life. Like if you have a group of friends, if you can't decide what to do, you say, okay, put it to a vote. And what's usually said is, well, whoever gets the most votes, wins. And I guess kind of the appeal is that majority rule means, at least in the case of picking a movie or dinner, you annoy the fewest number of people. You always annoy somebody, unless it's unless it's unanimous. Now his concern with majority rule is this. He thinks that what should be done is what is morally right. And the majority thinks if we just go by not what is right, but what the majority says, we won't always have justice. Because what the majority want and what is right are not the same, at least for him, not the same thing. Because the majority might want things that are bad. They might want to, as we'll see when we talk about John Stuart Mill, they may wish to mistreat or oppress or harm some other people. Now, what's right about that? Does the majority sometimes vote for things that are bad for other people?
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes fairly often. So, yeah, if someone says most people want this, it doesn't follow that it's a good idea or that it's morally right. This is why I think, I said that Thoreau would probably be horrified by Trump, and this is part of the reason, because what Thoreau thinks is that we should act based on, justice. We should do what is morally right. Now, someone could say, well, Trump believes what he's doing is morally right, and as we'll see when we talk more about Thoreau, Thoreau's conception of like what's right and good, given what he opposed, he would regard things like, tracking people and having the government get in everybody's business, registering people because they're Muslims, etc., as more government and oppressive government. So he'd be opposed to that kind of thing. So what should we do? Well, he thinks we should go with our conscience. And one of his arguments is that if we just go along with the government, we're surrendering our moral decisions or conscience to the rulers, to the governors. But he raises, it's kind of an argument kind of by question, which is kind of a bad argument. But he says, why then do we have a conscience? If we were just supposed to do what we're told to do, we wouldn't need that. And so he argues we should go along with our conscience. Now, one problem that Thoreau doesn't consider here is something we mentioned before, namely, what if someone's got a bad conscience? What if they think they're right, but they're actually wrong, they're really bad? For example, Thoreau would disagree with Trump. Some of Trump's proposals have been, put a big wall, around blocking up Mexico, essentially creating a database of Muslim American citizens, making them identify, by faith, etc. And many people think that would be horrible. They look back and they say that seems very similar to what happened in, they bring up the Nazi analogy, what happened in Germany, and they think that's bad. But you might say, well, Trump may think what he's doing is completely right, acting in accord with his with his conscience, which we all may disagree with. And so we have people who think they're doing the right thing, but we may believe they're wrong. And of course, there's also the thing, we may be that person. For example, Trump could be right. People who disagree with him, he could have, be on the side of the angels, and everyone who disagrees with him would be totally wrong. Because the challenge is, how do you know that you think the other person's wrong, but how do you know for sure you're right? But that's kind of a weak point there. So Thoreau says go with your conscience, but there is a practical problem of how do you know you really get it right. Now, he considers the people who obey the state. The military and police, for the most part, he says, provide the force for the state and essentially serve as like the body. And he thinks that they should also, well, not surprisingly, agree with him. that they should consider whether the war they're fighting is just or unjust. You know, in his case, his concern was the Mexican-American War, which he considered very unjust, and also the police. If they're ordered to do things that, if they believe it's unjust, they shouldn't just go along. For example, we could take the case of one thing that's gotten attention, you know, in recent years is that many, you know, towns and communities fund their government basically by policing. So they go out and, you know, give people tickets, you know, and then they have fines if you can't pay your ticket, and fines for the court appearances, and fines for being late. And the claim is they're not really policing to police, to maintain order, they're policing to make money for the town, which of course is a terrible burden because the people that are targeted are people who are poor. Because you don't go after the rich people because they have a lot of money, but they have lawyers, and they have a lot of influence, so they target, you know, typically poor people. And so what Thoreau would say, well, it's perfectly legal, but they should go against that, assuming that they morally disagree with it. And sometimes it does happen. For example, in Chicago, there was a person, young man, 17-year-old, who was shot like 16 times, a lot of times. And the reason why the media, basically people found out about it was because someone in the police department leaked that there was a video showing the person being shot. And so Thoreau would agree with that. The people should follow their conscience even when the authorities tell them, you know, not to. Now, this of course does lead to a serious, you know, concern, because in the military, it works by, you have to be able to follow orders, and you have to, if you're like a private or corporal or even like a captain, you may not know all that's going on. And so if you just question everything, that could result in disaster. Sometimes you just have to say, okay, it's an order, I don't know exactly what's going on, but I've got to do this, because the alternative could be, you know, mission failure, lots of death. And the similar with the police. You know, like I gave the example of the person who was like a racist, but was told to protect civil rights marchers. And so it's good that he obeyed that. So there is the concerns about, you know, if people just kind of strike out on their own, what kind of consequences that could have, which is, you know, an important moral question. When should you follow the orders, and when should you say no? And interestingly, the military does have a pretty well-developed code about, you know, illegal orders and immoral orders, arising primarily out of World War II, the Nuremberg trials. He also considers people who hold office, you know, politicians, etc. And he says, whereas the military and police mostly serve the state physically, the office holders serve it with their minds, you know, writing laws and, you know, doing judging and so forth. Now he thinks when these people obey the state, that he notes that, well, roughly put, that intelligence serves the devil just as well as it serves, you know, God. So if they're just going along with the rules and not following their conscience, they can do all kinds of bad stuff. Even though they're not, maybe they're not shooting people or, you know, arresting people, they're still imposing, say, unjust laws. For example, I mean, to use a modern example, there's a lot of concern about the fairness of mandatory sentencing for people. Also, the controversial one about sentencing for cocaine versus crack. And so it might be said that, you know, people who hold offices, who are just imposing, you know, harsh, you know, sentences on people, and just, even though they might disagree with them, well, to use an even more concrete example, I recently heard on the news about a person who was sentenced for years, like 23 years, a really long time in prison, and even though the judge thought he was innocent, but just the way the trial was handled, he was found guilty. And so pretty much even when the person who committed the crime was actually convicted for that crime and put in jail, they still wouldn't let him go. And so one concern is, well, the way the system kind of, the judge, even though the judge believed he was innocent and it was all wrong, the judge still went along with the law. Now you could argue, well, if you're a judge, you got to go to the law. Thoreau would say, though, well, if you're doing injustice, you're doing injustice. That you have an obligation to obey your conscience. Which again is another important moral question. To use a final example, the famous, clerk who refused to, she followed her conscience. She refused to issue those permits. And so he might say, well, Thoreau would say, yay for following your conscience, but then there's a question of, is that a good conscience? So there's that question. Sometimes you might say, well, you should go along with the law because maybe the law is right, even if your conscience goes against it. Lastly, and appropriately to close on, heroes. He says there are some people who serve the state not by the body, not by the intellect, but by their conscience. And they, for the most part, he says, they tend to oppose the state because he thinks, being a good small government, good anarchist, that he thinks the government is usually up to no good. And so people who act by conscience would tend to oppose the state, but they are the people who are serving it best, because they are trying to get the state to do the right thing. So that brings the end of the pre-Thanksgiving stuff. Before ending for today, anything about the stuff for Thanksgiving that needs more stuff, like perhaps turkey cooking tips?
No, I don't even cook turkey.
I
I never stay in the kitchen. I always try to stay away. I'm just an eater.